let's get the next portion of this symposium going. You will now be hearing from somebody who we're very honored to have with us. Paul Taylor is a very well-recognized leader of a great nonprofit. He's a teacher, he's a media commentator and activist. He was the executive director of FoodShare Toronto, which is the largest food justice organization in this country. He also teaches at Simon Fraser University about fundraising and about leadership. In 2020, he was named one of Canada's top 40 under 40. Paul, I don't know if you're still under 40. We don't have to even talk about that. You can keep your age to yourself, but I welcome you to share everything else that you know with us right now. Paul Taylor, welcome to the symposium.
Oh, thank you so much for the wonderful welcome. And I will out myself and say that I am no longer 40, but you know, I was very fortunate to receive that award, and it's evidence that I once was under 40. So I'm appreciative. But in any event, good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted and honored to be with you this morning. You know, as I like to spend some time thinking about, really intentionally about what I'm going to share when I have an opportunity to share things that I've been thinking. So, you know, I had imagined that I would be sharing some perspectives on the interconnectedness of food insecurity and the impacts of climate change. But, you know, instead, what I've decided to focus on today is, you know, some of the activism that I've been involved in. And I think some of the activism that likely you're all involved in, or some of you are involved in, and about how we work together in community to help advance not just things like climate justice, but justice overall. And I approach this, actually, I'll take a step back, because I think, you know, these injustices that we see are often deeply connected and in many cases share the same root causes. So I think to advance change in this context means advocating for really fundamental structural systemic shifts. So I want to acknowledge that while much of this work is urgent, you know, and I see people taking the significant risks of being on the front lines of land and water defense or simply our human rights defense. And, you know, that work can be risky, it can feel daunting and sometimes very lonely. So our movements for justice, you know, be it Indigenous sovereignty, food justice, climate justice, migrant justice, disability justice, gender justice, economic justice, you know, I think at the core of those things, it's really important in our work that we prioritize care for ourselves and for those advocating for something better alongside us. So if you take one thing, only one thing from my remarks today, may it be a reminder to prioritize caring for yourself, so that you can continue to be curious, continue to care about issues that matter, and continue to work for caring for our communities, each other, and of course, the planet. This isn't optional, and it shouldn't be radical. You know, thinking about care for ourselves and centering care shouldn't be radical. It should be an orientation or how we anchor our work for a more just society. So before I dive in, I'm going to share a bit about me and some of the work that I'm involved in and have been involved in over the years. Right now, I'm the principal consultant at a consultancy that I co-founded called Evenings and Weekends Consultants, where we collaborate with other groups to help them in advancing their social impact and some good and needed change. But just before that, I spent close to 6 years as the executive director of an organization called FoodShare Toronto, a place that was really near and dear to my heart. And being someone that grew up in Toronto, you know, FoodShare has just been an incredible organization that has impacted lives right across this city. So such an honor to have the privilege to work at FoodShare and certainly to lead FoodShare. For those of you that aren't familiar with FoodShare, it's an organization that's focused on challenging, again, the injustice that is food insecurity, an injustice that many have come to realize, like many of the injustices that we recognize, are disproportionately bestowed upon Black and Indigenous peoples across this land. At FoodShare, one of the things that we really do is, you know, work to challenge these injustices by leveraging our resources as an organization to collaborate and invest in communities that have been forced to navigate chronic and generational underinvestment. So we work with communities to harness the resources to build, develop, and sustain community-led food infrastructure. So resident-led, community-run. And we do that because we recognize that capitalism has made it so that food infrastructure in communities primarily rests in the hands of those looking to make the most profit. And they often do so with little regard for workers, our right to food, or the health of the planet. We know that capitalism will not nourish our communities. It extracts from our communities. Capitalism, along with, oppressive organizing principles like white supremacy, cis heteropatriarchy, and colonialism, are all the founding fathers of the inequities that I think many of us aim to dismantle. Now, one thing that I've come to realize is that we're often doing this work, of challenging these systems and the harm that they cause. When I look at who we're doing this work with, one of the things I realize is, and that isn't all acknowledged enough, I think, is that we're often doing this work alongside racialized women. Women that are often doing the work that is vital to our communities, vital to our survival, and vital to our continued resistance. Work that, far too often is undervalued. They're often unpaid for the work that they do to support our communities. And I think about women like my grandmother. I talk about her as often as I can because she's been a major influence on my life. Maisie Olivia Baker Burt. I wish I had more time with her, but even though she died when I was 11, I had the opportunity to learn an incredible amount from her. I learned about my responsibility to community. My grandmother didn't have much. She was materially poor, but she used the little that she had to support as many folks in the community as she possibly could. She may have had, a little bit to eat for her and her 3 children, but she stretched what she did have to feed as many kids and folks in need that she possibly could. But despite the heavy lifting of women like my grandmother and my mother after her, Black and brown women and their families bear the brunt of the devastating effects of capitalism, of white supremacy, and of course, climate change, poverty, food insecurity, poor health outcomes. Our communities, when I think about the communities in which we live and the communities in which I grew up and spent time in, our communities are often located along land that is seen by government officials and planners as sacrificial buffer zones, often between highway interchanges and heavy industry. It's the first communities to be affected by coastal erosion, drought, or flooding. It's a testing zone for the new power plant, water treatment facility, or garbage dump. In essence, I've come to realize that these are the priority neighborhoods that are never really prioritized for any of the good stuff. What I just described is also an incredible example of environmental racism that many of us are forced to endure. Oddly enough, if you asked me what environmental racism meant when I was a child, I probably would have looked at you as if you just rocked up from Pluto. I wouldn't have told you that environmental racism is likely the reason that I take Advair, a medication called Advair, twice a day, and a Ventolin puffer when I need it as I try to control my asthma. I certainly wouldn't have told you, if you asked me about what environmental racism was, I certainly wouldn't have told you anything about the TTC bus garage. TTC, for those, the TTC is the Toronto Transit Commission, so our public transit, the bus garage across the street from my childhood home, or the diesel fumes that they emitted constantly. I certainly wouldn't have mentioned anything about the smelly factory that was next door to the TTC bus garage. I didn't even know what they did inside that building. As a little boy, I just saw people, mainly, again, Black and brown folks, coming and going. They all seemed nice, always very friendly, but often looked tired, exhausted, and sometimes defeated. When I got older, I learned that factory was a gelatin factory, and I learned what gelatin was, which explained, of course, the awful smell, but also why we were able to afford to live there. The health impacts of where we lived were known. They just weren't known to us. That was the reality for me and my neighbors on the street that I grew up in, the street that I grew up on just off of Lansdowne in Toronto's West End. A vibrant community that was once, made up of predominantly low-income, racialized newcomer families. It was a wonderful place to live as a child. There were so many things, though, that I didn't realize. And, this example that I've shared with you is what racism has looked like in this country. It's in particular, in those examples, environmental racism and the way that it's been sanctioned by every level of our government. Across Canada, we see toxic dumps, polluting projects, risky pipelines, tainted drinking water. Those are all routinely foisted upon our communities. Oddly enough, we live in one of the richest countries in the world. There should be stronger and enforceable laws that act as safeguards and help ensure that everyone has access to clean air, clean water, clean housing, and nutritious food. It befuddles me because it makes me think about, what we call in this country healthcare, or our healthcare system. We are so incredibly proud of it. But how can we be proud of our healthcare system? I would barely call it a sick care system, because I feel like a healthcare system would prioritize our health by focusing more upstream, focusing on doing things like protecting our fundamental human rights, our right to housing, our right to food, to water, to a healthy environment. These are important factors when it comes to our health and healthy outcomes. But for some reason, we really see these issues as very separate, and we spend a lot of time in our silos working with folks that we think understand the issue that we do. But we don't often spend time trying to recognize how these issues are linked and how the oppressive organizing principles that have allowed food inequities, the climate crisis, and all of these issues to reach the peaks that they're at this moment, is really important for us to recognize. We have rights. We have the right to food. We have the right to housing. But if we have a right to housing, why is it that we're seeing in communities, we're seeing armed police storm encampments with seemingly little regard for where our houseless neighbors end up? And those who are alongside them demanding better end up getting pepper sprayed. Far too often, this is what happens when we fight the system and we push back on the ways that it harms folks in our communities, be it as a result of the climate crisis, food insecurity, housing insecurity, as we've mentioned, the list goes on. Unfortunately, so many of these harmful decisions are made by our elected officials themselves, or they simply look away as companies, large corporations wreak long-term havoc on our communities and the planet. Knowing this is what inspired me to run for federal office in the last 2 elections. I won't get into what party and all of that, but I ran even in the most recent election. I came pretty close to defeating a 2-term incumbent with a record on climate. I wouldn't say a great one, but just 1,700 votes separated us. And one of the reasons I ran, and I share this, because I hope it inspires some of you who think about wanting to advance change and looking at various avenues for you to do that. I ran because I wanted to see change. I needed to see change, and I think we all do. The change that we know is possible, what we're experiencing now, what we're talking about now, what we're talking about today, and maybe what we were talking about tomorrow and yesterday, these things aren't inevitable. I wish I could say 100%, I 100% believe that politics and elected officials were going to save us from the inequities that exist everywhere, from the climate crisis, poverty, and food insecurity, but I can't. Because we seem to have too many politicians that don't seem to want to fight like they actually want to win. What I can say, though, like my grandmother always did, I'm going to continue to do what I can to support the communities that need it, the communities that seem to always be at the back of the line when it comes to anything good. And I encourage you to continue to do the same. I want to share a little bit, I know I'm jumping around a little bit, but I want to share a few examples about, what it means to use your power, use your privilege to be able to advance change on issues that matter to you. I was up until very recently in a position of leadership, again, at an organization, as I mentioned, called FoodShare, and several other organizations. But, FoodShare in specific, I want to share some of the things that we did to center people and to push back on some of those oppressive organizing principles that I've been talking about. First of all, it's recognizing and acknowledging and addressing the way that white supremacy, things like white supremacy, show up in our work, show up in our hiring. So we do things like anonymizing resumes when we have a job posting. We outreach a little bit differently. We could post in the normal places, but we forge relationships and are very relational with individuals and groups working with folks from equity deserving communities. When I started at FoodShare, the minimum wage there was $12 an hour, the minimum wage for the organization, so what the lowest person was paid. I'm really proud to say that, as I left, the minimum wage had increased to $24 an hour. So folks who had been there when I started, who were making $12 an hour, who were struggling, are now doing a little bit better. And I think when we think about these issues and how they're all interconnected, again, who's most likely to be reflected at those low wage positions at any organization? Well, it's typically Black and brown folks. So we've done a lot, that I'm really proud of. I could go on, but I won't, I'm proud of what my colleagues and I have accomplished together at FoodShare. But part of the reason that I've moved on is because I feel that there's much more to do. there's much more to do for all of us. You know, I'll never forget, I was interviewed I had the opportunity to interview David Suzuki and his wife, Tara Cullis. And what he said to me has resonated ever since. You know, he said that he has spent so much time fighting against this pipeline and this tar sands and all of these sorts of issues, but recognizing that they just pop up. They just pop up again. They just pop up again. And really where we need to focus is we need to focus on the root causes. We need to understand and really reckon with these oppressive organizing principles that have allowed the climate crisis to exist. And then we start to really find that we're addressing not just, you know, a legacy of climate inaction, but we start to really challenge things like food insecurity, poverty, and homelessness. And we start to, you know, be what a wealthy country, I think, should look like, and the way that we should be leading and setting an example. The way that I lead is, you know, I believe that we've all actually been passed a baton from our elders. You know, the folks who carried it long and far, folks who have made our very existence possible. And I feel that when we're holding the baton like we all are, it means that it's our time to lead. It's our time to bring about great change. Because one day we're also going to be the ancestors who have passed the baton on to other people. And those folks are going to take it to places that we can't imagine. So together, you know, now and into the future, let's keep fighting for better. Let's not accept the status quo. Let's not believe that the inevitable of what we're experiencing right now, is inevitable. We all need to keep fighting for the better that we all know is possible. I hope you have received my words this morning in a good way, with open hearts and with open minds. If you'd like to stay in touch, I encourage you to do so. I'm on all of the socially things as Paul Taylor TO. Again, I'm truly honored to have been invited to share a few words with you today. Thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to hearing some of your questions today. Oh, thank you, folks. I'm just seeing I'm seeing comments in the question and answer and in the chat here. Let's see. Hold on.
Yeah, Paul, I don't know if you can hear me here as well. I do want to say thank you for this chat, you know, particularly speaking about environmental racism. I was actually introduced to you by my friend Joshna Maharaj. She turned me
Yes,
up to Joshna as a chef and an activist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I started following you on Instagram, and I mean, just a month of following you, and you realize you always kind of maybe know, suspect, think, but when you follow Paul Taylor, you understand this intersection of the environment is not just the environment. It's not just the sky. It's just not weather, but it's food. It's food service, it's minimum wage, it's housing. And I was so happy that you spoke about that here, because if you didn't, I was going to ask you those questions too. But I think, you know, that type of these type of situations that we find ourselves in, as you say, it feels grossly unfair because of how much money is made and how much is created and produced in this province. I wanted to get to a question. We have a first question that's sort of on this very note. And I love this question because it's about taking action. And somebody has asked, do we need to increase awareness about environmental racism as you've defined it in order to encourage greater engagement in specific issues? And how do we do that?
That's a great question. And I think it gets to the heart of, okay, so do we need to increase awareness around environmental racism? Well, that's really interesting, because many of us have experienced environmental racism. So we don't need to have our awareness raised about it. I think there are some folks who have no idea that it exists, or any idea what it is or what it looks like. You know, so if you're from one of those communities, perhaps on this call, you know, on this Zoom, I think it is, I would encourage you to, you know, make it your work to have those conversations with folks in your communities, for folks who may not be familiar with what environmental racism is and how it impacts communities of color disproportionately, and encouraging folks and yourselves to contact your elected officials and ask them what they're doing to not just combat the climate crisis, which is essential, but also what are they doing to challenge the legacy and the ongoing experiences of environmental racism for racialized communities.
pardon me, you might find a situation where when people ask those questions, you may not get an answer because the people being asked don't even really know what environmental racism it is, which makes it even more important to ask those questions, right? Because then
Exactly.
the people who are responsible for, caretaking or instructing or leading will need to find out themselves, what is this environmental racism that I keep hearing about it? I better educate myself on what this is. And it's illuminating, and it's an onion, right? Once you find out about it, you're like, oh, this goes far, far deeper than I even considered. And I'm a guy with, I studied political science. I have a master. I don't consider myself uneducated, but you have blind spots, and you can forgive yourself for having blind spots. But once you are turned on to something, now it's not for, now you got to get into it. And
Absolutely. Once you see, you can't unsee what you've seen or unhear what you've heard. Absolutely agree.
Some more questions coming in, as I fully expected them to. There's a question from a student. Somebody was asking how old you were when you started becoming aware and interested in activism. And activism is in quotes because I don't know if you called it that when you became interested in it.
That's a great question. And I would say, I think I know exactly when it was about 13. And I remember that because I mentioned growing up in a low income household, we were on social assistance. Well, when I was 13, the then Premier of Ontario made a decision to decrease the amount of money that families received on social assistance by about 22%. So you can imagine the impact on low income families across Ontario, who were then forced to live on 22% less money to buy food and all of the things. So I remember that really pivotal point in the conversations around that in the media, and this idea of a common sense revolution. And it was just, it was nonsensical to me. But more importantly, I saw that it caused a lot of pain to my family and to families across this province, families that, I went to school with, kids that I went to school with who now had less food. So, that is what really alerted me to the fact that there were forces outside of what was happening in our home that was affecting, my everyday life. And that if I wanted to see change, I had to start figuring out chasing those strings of trying to figure out how do I understand this issue a little bit more and advance change. So I would say I was about 13 when I started really diving into kind of understanding issues of inequity and political inaction around social issues.
That's great. You would have probably considered that early, but as we're seeing, there's grade 7 students from schools and, young people, they're excited about this, and it's a great thing. You would have been probably a pioneer at age 13 in your day, but we've got people younger and younger coming into us, which is exciting. Another question that came here for you was about, could you please speak, Paul, to the examples of urban and school gardening and farming programs and what their impact is?
Oh, this is a great question. And I think it's important to now say that my views do not represent the views of blah, 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 blah. Actually, I don't work at FoodShare anymore. So maybe I can say this. I can say this without having to whatever I just did. But I think school gardens and all of these things are so wonderful. And I know many good people who advocate for them, who participate in them. The impacts are, yes, we live in urban city. Many of us live in urban centers, very limited green space. So connecting young people to food that's grown in front of them and recognizing what that process looks like and our relationship, I think is all very important. But I think it's also important not to confuse its impact. So I love that the question was around impact. There is no evidence that suggests that any type of school garden has a direct impact on reducing food insecurity. So that's the issue that I spend a lot of time working on, and that I spend a lot of time talking to people about. And food insecurity is really an issue of income. So school gardens, school meals, all of those things are wonderful and helpful and do things. But when it comes to tackling food insecurity, it actually has very little to do with food. It's about families having enough to purchase what they need. So the types of interventions that are more effective are often things like increasing minimum wage, things that make housing more affordable, things that make medicine more affordable, transportation, that sort of thing. So the costs that things that reduce people's costs actually is what has an impact on food insecurity, much more impact than whether or not they were able to grow food in a school garden.
Okay. Another question is about rural communities and your thoughts about how these communities can attack some of the issues that you discussed, which often drive people to larger centers.
Mm. Yeah, so it's how to I actually, so maybe can you repeat the question again?
Sure. I mean, there's two questions on the same subject. One was, what are your thoughts on rural communities and how they can attack some of the issues you discuss, which often drive people to larger centers? And
Okay.
somewhat related was another question where somebody named Chris had asked, much of what you've spoken seems to have an urban focus. What can you say about the rural-urban divide generally and from the racial equity perspective? They're semi-related, but both rooted in this idea of rural and urban.
Okay, great. I've got an easy, maybe unfortunately, but I've got an easy question for that, and that will largely, easy answer for that, but unfortunately be largely I think, unsatisfying. And it's that I don't know. I am a person of color that's lived in an urban center my entire life, so I wouldn't purport to know about the experiences of folks living in rural areas, or racialized folks in rural areas, or even some of the specific unique challenges that folks in rural areas face around some of these issues. And I think, while it's an unsatisfying answer, I think it's really important, as we think about issues, to recognize, one, when we should and shouldn't comment, and when our perspectives are appropriate to be shared, because because we have a space or a mic in front of us, sometimes we think that that means that all of our perspectives are needed and valued. But I think it's really important, when you're in those situations, to really think about what you should be commenting on and shouldn't be commenting. I typically don't comment on Indigenous issues because I'm not Indigenous, other than the work that I do to be in solidarity with Indigenous folks.
Very well said, Paul. It's okay to say, I don't know sometimes, and sometimes we forget about that. Here's a question you will not say, I don't know about, I imagine, because it is about city and policymakers. What key commitment would you like to hear from city policymakers that would give you some hope?
Okay. You know what, I'm going to say that from all policymakers, actually, I think we have a problem with the way that and many problems perhaps with the way that we approach policy and politics. But I think one big problem, and I'll take the example of basic income that has become contentious. It's become contentious because people have various ideas on what it should look like, and all the sort, this and that and the other. But I think we actually have to stop focusing on specific policies and stop allowing ourselves. That supports the kind of siloed thinking that isn't helpful, I think, in attacking these issues. So I think what we need to be thinking about is, again, we live in one of the richest countries in the world. We should be able to all thrive. So I think we should be evaluating policies around a framework that is rooted in ensuring that we can all thrive, not, this kind of tinkering and incremental responses to really profound issues. We really need to be all able to thrive. And I think if that's the framework that our elected officials are using to advance policy, and we're demanding that that's what they're using to advance policy, I think we would start to see real action on the issues that many of us care about.
Okay. I'll also ask you this. I think you would possibly have some input on this. Somebody has written to us, they are a forest therapy guide. Thrilled to hear you talk about self-care. As a guide, forest therapy, access to green spaces in urban areas is a huge concern, especially green spaces with washrooms and other comforts. Do you have any thoughts on how to place greater value on creating and preserving urban green spaces?
I think in the context in which we live right now, I think one of the, we have to nudge and insist that I think when we think about our politicians, I see far too many people kind of go into meeting with politicians very sheepishly, like these are people who get a chunk of our paycheck, and they are tasked with representing us and advancing our interests. So I think anything that we care about, we should be making sure that we are establishing relationships with our elected officials at every level, and making sure that they know that these are priorities for us, and asking them to update you on what they're doing to address those priorities and provide space for you to be able to share your feedback. That is, democracy is not about voting once every 4 or so years. It's really about what happens, I think, in between elections and how we hold elected leaders accountable. If we only focus on every 4 years, that's when we miss opportunities to really put pressure around climate change and other issues. So that in between elections time is really important in terms of advancing issues of priority.
All right. I will tell people that we have about 12 minutes left with Paul. I see a lot of messages. If you have other questions, send them in and we'll see if there's other ways we can answer them after the fact. But somebody has said to me, to you, I just moved from Vancouver to Kingston. I realize that there are many steps for an older city like Kingston to be ready to have a conversation about sharp issues like environmental racism. What were those poignant conversations happening for the past 10, 20 years in Toronto for Toronto to be ready to talk about environmental racism?
This is a really interesting question. I'm imagining that the folks that are not ready are the white folks in the city that are not ready, because this is something, again, that racialized folks have been experiencing. So when we don't talk about these things because we feel that people, white folks, are not ready to deal with these issues, we're not doing we're doing a disservice to the issue and those affected by it. So I think what we need to do is, actually, ready or not, we need to be pushing these conversations, and maybe that's part of making cities and ready for these sorts of conversations. I think it's really important, when we categorize where something is or where a city is, we have to think about, whose voices or perspectives are we positioning as where the city's at. I think that's really important. So
it touches again on this accountability issue that you were talking about, right? That no sheepishness. We voted for people who are in elected positions, and leaders should lead and be held accountable.
Yeah.
I think that it touches on that as well. You have to be able to have tough conversations with people in tough positions, quite simply.
For sure. And I think if we don't have these kinds of conversations, we are continuing to advance white supremacy and center whiteness. And, there was a time, I think, even at FoodShare, where these sorts of things, people felt like, oh, we're not ready to have these conversations. People are going to be too hurt or uncomfortable. Well, I'll tell you what's uncomfortable. Racism is uncomfortable. And if we don't have those conversations, we're just picking who we're allowing to feel the discomfort.
I have a broader question for you. Can you speak about how food security is or will be impacted by climate change?
It's already impacting climate change. Everything. I think a big thing that I hear, because a lot of my work, as I said, is around food insecurity and access to food, is the impact it's having on prices. We know that climate change is impacting inflation. It is causing the poorest among us to struggle even more. Simply put, we now have in this country just under 6 million people that are food insecure. So there are a few factors that are causing that, but a contributing factor is certainly climate change and the impact that it's having on our farmers' ability to grow the crops that we need, as well as the costs associated with importing crops is also increasing. So we are seeing folks, especially those who are materially poor and struggling the most, experiencing severe food insecurity. Those folks, the crisis that they're experiencing is incredibly heightened as a result of climate change. Many of us, we're talking about plastic bags and not using plastic bags, or, some of us, I should say. Many of us, I think, on this call are having likely more sophisticated conversations around climate interventions, but those types of conversations, again, center some people's experience. When we're looking at what's happening as a result of climate change to food insecurity, we're seeing that there was a crisis before we started even really, recognizing the climate crisis more broadly, the crisis of food insecurity, and that's only been heightened as a result of the climate crisis. But still, we allow it to continue. We allow it all to continue.
Tell me about, you teach at Simon Fraser, and it's leadership and fundraising. Two things you know about from your time at FoodShare. Do you do fundraising presently for anything? Is that still part of your life?
No, oddly enough, just through our consulting work, we will have clients reach out to us who are looking for support. I really feel part of the reason I teach this course and develop this course and help organizations through our consulting work is because we recognize in advancing change, you need resources to advance that change. And that's often not a part of the conversation. And from an equity perspective, there are some communities who have more ready access to the resources to advance the change that they see. So for me, fundraising is an opportunity to actually center equity and center justice and ensure that folks looking to advance really important change have access to the resources that they need to do that. So that's been so it's been a lot of fun to work with organizations in small groups and large groups who are looking to start new things, to engage them with our team to think through how they strategize around increasing their revenues.
I ask you about the fundraising, Paul, because as you've suggested, a community garden and the different things are great, maybe on a social level, but at the end of the day, the funds, the money, the wages, this is what's important so people can afford. What are the messages that you have to get to people that are maybe, the people who are fans and supporters are going to be there. The allies are going to be there when it's time to donate. But how do you get people who are not on board or on the fence? What messages do you give them about food insecurity and, climate change and how it's going to impact? What are the calls to action that you use? And I ask this question, it's a personal question, but I ask it on behalf of these young people who are listening, because, in the old days, it was door to door with the Girl Guides cookies and this kind of stuff. And can we raise funds for my hockey team, right? And the hockey team is a tangible thing. You see the hockey team, you see this kid, okay. But the future is going to be about fundraising for young people. Younger and younger are probably going to need to use some of the techniques you use. So I wonder if you can share some of that.
I would say, historically, what we've seen with fundraising is these kind of shock and awe presentations and really, shaming or guilting people into contributing funds. And I think there's that, and there's that which we've shifted from pretty profoundly, but there's also the idea that I think we're increasing our sophistication. We're recognizing that charity is not a solution to public policy issues. So FoodShare, for example, was not interested in growing our organization or getting donations for the sake of donations, because that is allowing capitalism to inform how we do our work, and it's not necessarily helpful. So we were interested in increasing our capacity to advance the change that we're looking to advance. So you share really specific opportunities for people to lend their support to being a part of that change, and helping people recognize that. And it's about, to me, more than fundraising. It's about I feel our responsibility at a moment when people are feeling like so much of what we experience right now is inevitable, or that change isn't possible. I feel like we have got to be showing people that change is possible. That it's not only possible, but it's needed. And these are the ways that we're going to get there. And this is what's possible, and taking people to, the kind of world that we could be living in. I believe that things like poverty and food insecurity belong in our history books. Even thinking like that, and thinking that is possible, I think is really important for folks, because we don't think like that. We think that it's acceptable to see someone sleeping over a grate on the street. We think it's acceptable to have to donate our leftover food to a food bank. We think it's acceptable for Starbucks to donate a bag of their day-old muffins to people who are food insecure through a charity. None of these things are inevitable, and none of these things should continue. So I think we need to work on putting these things in our history books, and we need everybody's help to do that.
I have time for just two more questions, so I'm going to ask you these here. You spoke about being a young Black man in a in a low income situation. I think, a lot of the people you'll be talking to are middle class. So somebody has asked, from that perspective, what can individuals in middle class communities who are largely isolated from food insecurity, not affected by it. How do they promote food security? Can neighborhoods play a role in working towards food justice, or is this really something we have to attack on a policy and systemic level?
Well, I think there are ways to get to that policy and systemic level that, in our communities, in our homes, with our neighbors, with our friends, we can participate in getting to that place. So I think, I encourage anyone, if they're interested in the issue of food insecurity and trying to understand, why things like charity are not a solution to food insecurity, really, really spend the time, take the time to dive into that issue. I encourage people to look at the work of Proof, a group called Proof out of the University of Toronto. They do great work looking at food insecurity, what its causes are, and what the potential solutions are. And I would encourage people, if you think you are separate from this issue and you and your neighbors are separate from this issue, you have an opportunity to build solidarity. So I think you have an opportunity to invite folks from your community who may be separate from this issue or not experience it in the same way to a dinner, perhaps. And dinner at your home, where maybe you're talking about some of the things you're learning about food insecurity, and maybe you're asking your neighbors to help you do something more about this issue. Maybe you're asking your neighbors to join you when you go and meet with your elected officials in your neighborhood, or maybe you're asking them to sign on to a letter that you send. But that work is really important, because to advance change, often our politicians need to feel that pressure coming from our communities. So the more that we can do to help seize opportunities for public education, seize opportunities to talk to our neighbors about these issues and how grave they are, that is actually a really important part of the process. So I really encourage folks to do that. But it starts with learning. Don't have a dinner and encourage people to bring a tin to donate to the food bank because we're going to solve food insecurity, because that will not solve food insecurity. So really diving into the issue, because we've done the food bank thing for 40 years in this country. And while we've been doing that, we've seen food insecurity increase to heights that we've never seen before. So clearly we're not doing the right thing. Let's start having conversations about the right types of interventions, particularly around economic and social policy.
That's actually a good place to end it, Paul. I had another question, but you just answered it in what you were talking about. The theme this year is innovation in action, and people, I think, are asking from that perspective, what is the actions we can do? And, you're touching on this old saying, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results is insanity, right? And I think you're suggesting that we can't do what we've done. It clearly hasn't worked. Things have actually gotten worse. So thank you for suggesting these variety of things, including learning. You mentioned Proof as an organization that people should look up. Your roots are FoodShare, right? And like I have done, and I've learned so much just following you on Instagram, basic following you has taught me a lot and illuminated things and made me feel propelled to do things that are different and make changes and take action. Appreciate you very much, Paul. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ali. Such a pleasure. Really great to be here today. Thanks for having me. And I'll just say, folks want to get in touch again, Paul Taylor TO, or if you're interested in working with us on a project around consulting or evenings and weekends consulting, look out for us. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul.
I know.
All right, everyone, at 10:45, we're going to take a 10-minute break at 10:55, 5 minutes to the hour. We will see you back here. Enjoy a little stretch and a snack, and we'll see you back in a bit.